The men said no woman needed that much wood. They called it wasteful, ridiculous, laughable even. But the winter didn't laugh. The storm came down before she had finished the second roof. She could hear it over the ridge, a sound like 1,000 horses galloping through pine. She didn't lift her head from the beam she was sawing. Her cheeks were red from cold and wind, her gloves soaked through with snowmelt. It was too late to stop now. If she didn't close the outer cabin before nightfall, she'd lose the inner one to the wind, and if she lost that, her children would be the next thing taken. Eliza had been building for 31 days straight. The second cabin wasn't really a cabin at all, not by town standards. It didn't have its own stove or chimney, and it wasn't set on a foundation. It was a shell, a thick-walled, low-roofed, windowless rectangle of pine logs, hugging the outside of her real home like a wood coat. From a distance, it looked absurd. 2 cabins stacked tight, one surrounding the other. 2 front doors only a step apart. But to Eliza, it was survival. She'd started cutting the extra trees in September, while the rest of the valley focused on harvest. When she began laying the second layer of walls, the townsfolk called it vain. A woman building alone was already enough to stir gossip, but a woman building twice, well, that was pure theatre. "She's building a dollhouse for her house," said Amos Trigg, a farmer whose own chimney had collapsed last winter. "It's got more layers than her cooking." But Eliza didn't argue. She just kept sawing. Inside the first cabin, her children were already bundled in wool, coughing from the damp. The log seams had begun to weep with frost weeks earlier. Even with the stove burning through the night, they couldn't keep the floorboards warm. Cold seeped up through every knothole, turned the breath from their mouths into white fog by morning. That's when she knew. She wasn't building an outer cabin. She was building a second wall to stop death itself. The storm hit before sundown. It dropped like a curtain. The sky went white. The air turned sharp as knives. And as the wind howled through the valley, Eliza nailed the final board across the outer doorframe. 2 doors now, one to the wind, one to her home. She leaned against it as snow piled around her boots, and for the first time in weeks, her hands stopped shaking. The town couldn't see her from the ridge anymore. They figured the double structure had caved under its own weight. Nobody thought to hike out and check. Her children weren't enrolled in school. Her husband had been dead 4 winters. And a woman with no man, no horse, and too many ideas was just a story told in whispers at the tavern, until someone found her body. But no body came. Just smoke. Thick, steady smoke rising from the chimney that shouldn't have lasted. It wasn't until the third storm that they started to wonder. Not one of them had smoke by that point. The creek had frozen solid. Roofs were cracking, doors warped. Several families had been forced to burn furniture. One man's wife nearly died from smoke inhalation when they tried to vent the stove into a wall. But up the valley, on the ridge no one bothered with. Eliza's smoke kept climbing, every day, every night, sometimes so much it curled white against the clouds, while every other flue lay dead. Someone asked, half in jest, if she had found coal. Another man said maybe she'd moved into a cave, but one widow named June, whose youngest had just fallen sick, remembered something different. "She built it twice," she told her brother. "I remember. I saw her sawing boards for weeks. She said the cold gets through the gaps, so she'd make a second cabin. Just logs, just to trap the air." June paused. "That woman's not crazy," she added. "She's the only one who knew." Inside, the cabin glowed like a lantern. It was warmer than it had ever been. The outer walls had trapped the cold air and killed the drafts. The tiny dead space between the 2 cabins had created something Eliza couldn't even name, an insulation her stove could handle. She no longer had to burn pine through the night. Her children slept without frost crusting their hair, and every time she stepped out into the outer chamber, the space between the cabins, it felt like stepping into a cave with breath. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't freezing, and that was enough. Eliza kept it quiet. The front door, once visible from the valley trail, had now become a deep-set alcove, hidden behind the second entryway. The wind couldn't find it. The snow couldn't clog it. She shoveled only once a day. She didn't go to town. She rationed meat, boiled broth from bones, saved every ounce of heat. The second cabin didn't just keep out the wind. It made her invisible, untouchable. Her children began to laugh. Again, quietly, and when they cried, it was no longer from pain. But peace couldn't last in that valley, because people were dying, and dying men remember smoke. The knock came on the 16th night. It wasn't a desperate knock, not yet, not from a man starving. It was a polite knock, which somehow made it worse. Eliza froze by the stove. She heard her daughter stir in the loft, but waved her silent. Another knock. She opened the inner door slowly, waited to hear if the outer door would open. Nothing. Then, a voice. "Mom?" Eliza stepped into the outer chamber. A dim lantern lit the space. The frost on the inside of the second wall was a thick silver skin. Through the outer door's slats, she saw a figure. Not a man, a girl, maybe 16. "I'm from town," she said. I Heard you were warm. Eliza blinked, her jaw tightened. The girl's breath hitched. My little brother. He's sick. Mama's sick too. I told them you might have just something, room. Eliza's first instinct was to say no, but the girl didn't ask again. She stood there, shivering, her coat thin as paper, her hands blotched raw. Behind her, in the snow shadows, Eliza saw a second figure, a child, barely able to stand. They didn't look like they'd last the night. She let them in, only into the outer cabin, just for now. She closed the outer door, locked it, then went back to the inner one, cracked it just wide enough to hand the girl a blanket. She didn't say a word, just pointed to the bench along the inner shell wall, the one that wasn't warm, but wasn't freezing either. They sat. The girl wrapped the boy tight and rocked him. Eliza returned inside, shut the door. Her daughter asked, Mama, who is it? Eliza just shook her head. They'll be gone by morning. But she knew better. The smoke was too visible now, and the freeze hadn't even peaked. She expected them gone by dawn, but when Eliza stepped out into the shell cabin, just after sunrise, the girl hadn't moved. She was asleep, her little brother curled beneath her, both wrapped in the wool blanket Eliza had handed through the crack in the door. The bench was coated in frost. Their breath made ghosts in the cold light. She thought about shaking them awake, telling them to leave before the next wind rolled down off the ridge, but something held her back. The boy's hand was clutched tight around the girl's coat. She saw the red on his fingers, bright patches of raw skin, frostbite already chewing at him. If they'd stayed out another hour, they'd be frozen stiff. No firewood could fix that. Eliza stood there, silent, for several long seconds. Then she opened the inner door and whispered, Come inside, quiet. The girl startled, blinked, then nodded quickly. She picked up the boy, stumbling a little under his weight, and followed Eliza into the warm heart of the cabin. Her eyes widened when the heat hit her face. Her brother whimpered, half conscious. The moment the inner door shut behind them, she fell to her knees. I'll help, she said, not begging, offering. I'll cook, I'll clean, I'll chop. I can do anything. Just please don't send us back out. Eliza didn't answer right away. She ladled broth into 2 chipped mugs, set them on the floor, and turned toward the stove. Help when you can, she said flatly, and keep quiet when you can't. By the second night, the girl had done more than expected. Her name was Nora, and her brother's name was Caleb. Their father had frozen to death walking to the creek for water. Their mother had locked herself in the loft ever since, refusing food. The chimney at their homestead had cracked and collapsed. They'd spent the last week trying to melt snow in an iron pot to keep warm. When it stopped boiling, they curled up around it anyway, pretending the heat was still there. Nora hadn't come to beg. She'd come because she saw the smoke. I knew you were hiding something, she whispered that night as Eliza added kindling to the fire. People in town said you were crazy, said you'd built 2 cabins for no reason, but I remembered seeing you split wood while the rest of us were canning. You didn't just build, you prepared. Eliza didn't like compliments. They felt like distractions. She just shook her head and mumbled, I built twice because once wasn't enough. Nora understood. She began helping without being told, scraping potatoes, melting snow carefully so it didn't flood the floorboards, hanging the few scraps of drying laundry closer to the fire. When Caleb developed a wet cough, she didn't panic, just rocked him gently and asked Eliza for old cloth to wrap his chest. She rubbed lard on his frost-bitten fingers. She did all of it without raising her voice. Eliza hadn't meant to take them in, but now she couldn't imagine sending them back out. The next knock came 5 days later. It was louder, desperate. A man's voice. Eliza didn't answer. She watched from the inner window as heavy snow crunched beneath booted feet. The man paced outside the outer door, arms wrapped in a fur coat. He banged again, harder. Please, he said. My wife is freezing. Our baby hasn't stopped crying in 2 days. Nora stood behind Eliza, clutching her own blanket tight. She'll die, the man called out. They both will. Eliza's hands trembled. Her breath fogged the glass. He didn't try to open the outer door. He didn't shout again, but he stood there for nearly half an hour, just stood, waiting. Finally, he slumped down into the snow, pulled his knees to his chest, and whispered something Eliza couldn't hear. Then he walked back into the woods. She didn't see his wife. She didn't sleep that night. Nora was the one who broke the silence. They're going to come back, she said quietly, while mending a sock by the fire. Others, they're already watching. I've seen shapes in the trees. Eliza nodded. She'd seen them too, and she'd heard the sounds, the odd creaks and thumps, boots crunching snow where no one should be walking. The smoke was a beacon. No matter how careful she was with the fire, no matter how often she burned pine to cut the color, they could smell warmth. And warmth was a currency now. She thought about sealing the outer door completely, nailing it shut from the inside, leaving no access to the shell chamber. But then what? If someone truly desperate came, if a child froze on her threshold, What would that make her? Nora must have read her expression. You built a double cabin to keep your family alive, she said. But maybe you didn't build it just for you. That stung. It reminded Eliza of something her husband used to say, years before fever took him. The best shelter in the world ain't worth much if you're the only one in it. Back then, she used to laugh. Now it didn't sound so funny. The next knock was different. It came at dusk, soft, like a child tapping a spoon on a table. This time it was a child, a girl maybe 9 years old, wearing no gloves, cheeks flushed with cold. Her lips were blue. She didn't speak, just stared at the outer door and waited. Eliza opened it. The girl collapsed into the shell cabin, limp from exhaustion. Nora was already there, wrapping her in spare wool. Her eyes fluttered open just long enough to whisper, "Mama said this house had 2 coats." Then she fainted. By the 3rd week, they were no longer hiding the truth. The cabin held 10 people. Each time Eliza thought it was full, another knock came. And each time, she told herself it would be the last. But she'd made a second shell, and in that shell was space. Not warmth, not truly, but not death either. The shell could house 3 at a time before the air turned too sharp to breathe. So she rationed the shell like a barn, rotating people through it, one family at a time. She heated flat stones in the stove, wrapped them in wool, and placed them on the shell floor to fight the chill. It wasn't ideal, but they were alive. The stove was burning harder now, twice the logs. Eliza's stack was shrinking faster than expected. She rationed carefully, cooked 1 large pot of stew daily, stretched every root vegetable, every scrap of dried meat. But for every meal she shared, someone brought something, a pouch of beans, a frozen rabbit, a cracked bag of salt. One man offered her his wedding ring in exchange for 3 hours near the fire. She didn't take it, but she let him in, not because she wanted to, because he had a child. They called it the Shell House. Word spread through the valley fast once the snow hardened and the trail became walkable. Those who couldn't make it begged others to carry notes. "Please ask the widow to take us in. Tell her we'll chop wood in spring. We don't need heat, just walls." Some messages were written on bark, others on cloth. One note arrived stitched into a jacket. "I'm sorry I laughed." Eliza found it tucked into the coat of a woman who died on her doorstep. She buried her by the woodpile. Didn't say a word. Spring was still far off. The freeze had deepened. At night, ice formed inside the outer shell now. Eliza rotated sleepers, never allowing anyone to stay more than 2 hours in the shell, unless they were wrapped in 3 layers. The children slept near the stove. The elderly were tucked into corners with thick stones and boiled water. No one complained. Every single person knew. Without that second cabin, they'd be corpses. One night, while chopping a log by lantern light, Eliza heard someone behind her. It was Amos Trigg, the man who had mocked her the most. He stood there, hatless, hair stiff with snow, his boots wrapped in torn canvas. "I came to help," he said, not meeting her eyes. She stared at him, hands still on the axe handle. "My wife's gone," he added, "but my son's still breathing." He held out 2 thick pine logs, fresh cut. Eliza took them. The double cabin stopped being a joke. It became a blueprint, and every person who stepped inside learned to cut wood like her, learned to patch seams, learned to layer walls with leftover bark and dried mud. By mid-February, a 3rd partial shell had been started, built using scraps and timber from a fallen barn. They used it for overflow, a holding space. It barely held off the wind, but it bought another hour of life for those waiting. They weren't surviving in comfort, but they were surviving, and every single one of them owed it to the woman who'd built a coat for her house. By the end of the 4th week, Eliza stopped counting names. There were too many stories, too many faces huddled against the walls, wrapped in wool and silence, some speaking only when spoken to, others whispering. Prayers they thought no one heard. The shell cabin now held bodies shoulder to shoulder at all hours. Some stayed only a night and stumbled back down the ridge to their own cold homes. Some never left. Eliza's cabin had become more than shelter. It had become the last warm breath in a valley that couldn't exhale anymore. And still they came, sometimes dragging sleds of crying children, sometimes on foot with empty eyes and split skin. Once, 3 men showed up carrying their mother in a sheet. She had died just a mile away. "We didn't know where else to bring her," one said, voice flat with shock. Eliza didn't answer. She just pointed them to the side shed, the one she'd never finished, and helped them dig. The double cabin was no longer just hers. It couldn't be. A dozen hands kept it standing now. A half-dozen more chopped wood daily. The shell's door never stopped moving, opening, shutting, bracing against the wind. It creaked on its hinges like a voice, asking for rest. But it never broke, and neither did she. Some nights Eliza sat by the stove long after the others had fallen asleep, holding her axe like it was a second spine. Her children curled against her. Nora often stayed awake with her, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but never closing until Eliza nodded her off. The girl worked harder than most grown men, carrying buckets of melted snow, tending to the sick, watching the fire like it was the sun itself. One night Eliza said, "You don't have to do all this." Nora didn't look away from the flames. "If I don't, who will?" And then came the 6th week, the week the snow turned to knives. No one could walk without bleeding from the knees. The drifts had frozen solid, sharp as shale, cracking beneath boots like brittle glass. The wind tore down the east slope and slammed into the shell cabin hard enough to rattle the beams. One man broke his collarbone slipping on the trail. Another nearly lost 2 toes to frostbite, before Nora caught it and wrapped them in rabbit fur. And then came the fire, not in Eliza's home, in a cabin down the ridge, one of the last few with a working stove. The chimney cracked, sparks flew, the roof caught. The family escaped barefoot. By the time they reached the shell, they were near frozen. The mother collapsed in Eliza's arms. Her name was Ruth, and she would become the most important voice in the valley. But that wouldn't happen for many weeks. That night, she was nothing more than a trembling woman, clutching her baby and whispering. "We had no warning." Eliza saw the look in her eyes, the terror not of fire, but of finality, the realization that after that blaze, they had nothing. Ruth didn't cry. She just sat against the inner wall, rocking. That night, Eliza made a decision. She gathered the remaining logs, what little they had left of the original stack, and rationed each to one of the men still strong enough to swing an axe. She marked them, off in a ledger, barely legible, and pointed to the slope behind the cabin. "North tree line," she said. "Cut anything standing." Amos Trigg nodded. "Won't be much left to burn by spring." "There won't be a spring," Eliza snapped, "if we don't make it through the next 3 weeks." He didn't argue. That was the thing about Amos. He'd changed. The man who once mocked her now took orders like a soldier. He led the men to the woods, chopped all morning, returned with their hands bloodied but their sleds full. No one spoke much anymore. Even the children had gone quiet, learning the weight of each log, the worth of every coal. By the second night of that week, Eliza could see the fatigue in everyone's faces. And that's when she realized what she had to do next. She closed the inner door, not forever, just for long enough. She explained it in short, clipped sentences. "If the inner cabin's heat drops too far, we all die. We're sealing it. Tonight, those of us strongest stay in the shell, take shifts warming by the stove when needed. The children and elderly stay inside. No more open doors unless it's critical." A murmur ran through the room. Not panic, just fear. Amos nodded. "It's right. The warmth has to be protected." Nora spoke up. "I'll take first shift in the shell." Eliza looked at her. "You've done enough." Nora held her ground. "So have you." And so began the rotation. Every 4 hours they swapped, shell to cabin, cabin to shell. 2 people stayed awake at all times, one inside, one out. It was brutal, unrelenting. The shell never fully warmed, not even with heated stones, not even with every blanket in the house. But it didn't kill, not anymore. And that was the point. Each shift brought new understanding. Strangers became allies, even enemies shared blankets. One night, Amos sat beside a man he'd once brawled with over land boundaries. He handed the man a half-frozen biscuit. "Truce," he muttered. The man nodded. "Winter's bigger than both of us." But the biggest change came from Ruth. Once the fire was out of her eyes, she began to organize. She mapped the rotation shifts. She assigned cooks. She turned the outer cabin into a triage center, lining the wall with beds made from crates and wool. She even tore apart her own skirt to make bandages. When a child came down with fever, she mixed a poultice from pine needles and snowmelt. She'd been a midwife once. She never mentioned it, but the way she laid hands on sick children told Eliza all she needed to know. "Why didn't you lead before?" Eliza asked her one night. Ruth shrugged. "No one listened until the smoke." Eliza understood. The shell cabin changed again. It became a chapel, a barn, a ward, a waiting room, a place where life was decided not by wealth or name, but by need. At one point, Eliza counted 29 people living within her walls, 11 in the main cabin, 18 rotating through the shell. They ate in shifts, slept in pairs, prayed silently. They kept the fire going 24 hours a day, and still the snow kept falling. No one remembered a winter like it. And then one morning, everything stopped. No wind, no snow, no sound. Eliza stepped out into the shell and blinked. The world was blue and white and blinding. The drifts had frozen solid in the night, crusted over like glass. The trail was passable again, for now, but the cold hadn't lifted. It had only paused. The stillness was worse than the storm. It made her gut twist. Something was coming. She just didn't know what. It came at dusk, a man on horseback, alone. He didn't knock, he didn't speak. He stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the shell's door, staring at the double cabin like it was a ghost. His coat was black, his face was wind-burnt and hollow. Eliza stepped into the shell and stared back. "Are you here for shelter?" she asked. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm here to warn you." Nora stepped behind Eliza, frowning. The man's voice was hoarse. "There's sickness in the valley, near the river bend. Whole family's gone. Skin turned blue before the frost even hit. Eliza's stomach dropped. She took a step forward. How long? 3 days. Which family? Jacobson's, and maybe the Kern boys too, Nora gasped. Ruth, hearing the name, stood up behind them. We let the Kern boys sleep here a week ago, she whispered. No one moved. The fire inside the cabin crackled, and suddenly, the warmth didn't feel safe anymore. Eliza acted fast. She gathered everyone, stepped into the shell, and raised her voice louder than she'd ever allowed. We may have sickness among us. A ripple of panic started, but she slammed her palm against the wall. No one leaves. No one runs. We do this smart. We quarantine. She pointed to the half-built third shell, the overflow space. We move everyone there who had contact with the Kern boys. We rotate medics. We build a new stove. Amos stepped forward. We're short on fuel. We cut more, Eliza snapped. We're short on hands. Then we use ours. They built a fourth wall, not a full cabin, just a corner enclosure, sealed with tarps and branches, reinforced with mud and straw. They called it the fever tent. Ruth oversaw it. Eliza managed the rotations. The rest cut trees and boiled water by the gallon. It was no longer survival. It was a hospital. And through it all, Eliza never stopped. She didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a time. She chopped wood until her shoulders bled. She stirred stew until her fingers blistered. And when one of the children asked if she was scared, she finally said, "Every minute." The child nodded. Me too. But no one died, not that week, and when word reached town that Eliza's cabin had cured fever, people stopped laughing. Forever, they started copying, building second walls, shells, overhangs, even barns reinforced with dead air gaps. The joke that had started in autumn now saved half the valley, and Eliza, once the widow mocked for playing builder, was now called something else. The one who stayed warm. The wind came back 3 days later, sharper than before, howling down through the tree-cut slopes with a voice that sounded human. By then, the fever scare had passed, though not without a cost. Everyone who had passed through the fever tent now bore a raw edge, as if the chill had left a deeper mark than infection ever could. But they were alive, and being alive in February was a triumph. The fever had given Eliza more than fear. It had given her time. The man on the horse, the one who warned her, never returned. No one even knew his name. Some thought he'd died on his way down the ridge. Others believed he was from the other side of the river, a part of the valley they hadn't heard from since the freeze began. Eliza never speculated. She simply remembered what he said and what it meant. The sickness wasn't a storm. It didn't howl or break things. It came quiet, invisible, like a breath gone wrong. So she made the shell even tighter. More layers, more bracing. She took every tarp, every coat too thin to be useful, and used them to seal gaps. She stuffed the hollow between the two cabins with rags and old blankets. She reinforced the threshold between the shell and the main door with double hinges, so the wind would slam but never break through. It became harder to open, so tight now it hissed when pried apart. But she accepted the struggle. She wasn't guarding a cabin anymore. She was guarding a city. The population inside the double cabin had peaked at 34. No one else could fit, and those who came later, too weak to walk or too proud to ask, were directed to what became known as the outskirts, a string of dugouts, tents, and tarp-covered lean-tos built into the snowbanks beyond Eliza's fence. They clustered around her, smoke like moths to flame. Each day, Nora or Amos would walk down and check on them, delivering boiled water, bone broth, flat stones for warmth. Sometimes Eliza herself went, a shawl over her shoulders, a scarf wrapped tight across her nose. Once, a man from the outskirts fell to his knees when he saw her. "You built a fire the wind couldn't kill," he whispered. "God help me, I thought you were mad." "I was," Eliza answered, pulling him to his feet. "That's why I survived." But madness, even the useful kind, had its limits. The strain began to show in the eyes. Ruth, who had kept calm through the worst of the fever, now sat awake through the nights, muttering lists to herself. Salt, broth, snowmelt, flint, over and over, like a prayer. Amos began to lose weight rapidly, refusing to eat more than a crust at dinner. He insisted others needed it more. When Eliza cornered him and shoved a full bowl into his hands, he wept into it like it was gold. Even Nora, steady as stone, began to fade. She slept less, coughed more. Her fingers grew red at the tips. "She's pushing too hard," Eliza told Ruth in the corner one night. "So are you," Ruth said. "I don't have the luxury of stopping. Neither does she." That was the end of it. Then came the sound. One morning, as Eliza stepped into the shell to begin the first fire of the day, she heard it through the trees. Boom, not thunder, not a falling tree, something deeper. Boom. The shell walls shook. Dust drifted from the joists. People stirred inside, murmuring, blinking into the half-light. Eliza pressed her ear to the outer door. Boom. And then silence. They thought it might have been a rockfall, or maybe ice shifting in the gorge, but Amos, after staring out across the ridge for 2 straight hours, came inside with his jaw tight. That wasn't Earth. Eliza looked up from the stew. What then? Something man-made. She waited. He hesitated. There's a cabin. Used to be north of the river bend. Was built over a cellar. If the weight of snow collapsed it, and the stove was still burning. Eliza closed her eyes. It was an explosion. A blast of compressed air, chimney pressure, fire and wind meeting in the worst way. How many lived there? 6. They held a minute of silence that night. 6 more gone. That night, a vote was held. It was Ruth's idea. She stood in the middle of the inner cabin, her baby wrapped across her chest, voice calm but cold. "We cannot take any more," she said. "We've hit our edge. One more mouth, and we lose everything," murmurs. Then Amos stood. "She's right. We help the outskirts. But no more entries. From this day, the doors remain closed." Eyes turned to Eliza. She didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, fine. It wasn't agreement. It was resignation. And so it was that the widow's house, once mocked, now carried laws. But laws break like kindling when the wind gets cruel. On the coldest night of that entire winter, with temperatures falling below any remembered in town records, a boy no older than 9 staggered into the shell. He wasn't wrapped in wool. He wore a flour sack around his neck. His breath wheezed in wet gasps. His fingers had turned black. "She built twice, so we could live once." The summer brought too much color. After so many months of snow and shadow, of bone-gray skies and wind-flattened trees, the explosion of green felt almost vulgar. The pines shed their frost. The creek surged with meltwater. Wildflowers opened in the cracks between stones. To some, it was a miracle. To others, it was a memory they weren't ready to let go of. Eliza stood at the edge of her woodpile, axe in hand, and watched as the last snow patch slid off the roof of the shell cabin and vanished into the ground. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded once, sharp and slow, and turned back to splitting. Survival was its own rhythm now, and the rhythm didn't break for sunshine. People kept coming, not for warmth anymore, but for answers. Strangers rode up from 3 valleys over. They asked about the double walls, the air gaps, the method she used to brace the inner structure. One man wanted to know the precise angle she'd laid the joists in the roof of the shell. Another asked for diagrams. "Why?" Eliza asked, barely looking up from her chopping. "Because next winter might be worse." She handed him a log, then started sawing. A man from a distant logging town offered to buy her cabin, not just the idea, the whole structure. Said he wanted to dismantle it, haul it back board by board and reconstruct it in his town square as a monument. Called it a shrine to frontier ingenuity. Offered more money than she'd seen in 10 years. Eliza pointed to the graves behind the cabin. "Would you like to dig them up too?" she asked. The man blinked, stammered, said he hadn't meant disrespect. Eliza turned her back on him and didn't answer again. He left before nightfall. Children played in the shell cabin now, not all the time, but often enough. They called it the fort. Some hung blankets across the beams and whispered secrets between the inner and outer doors. One of them, a little girl named Annie, asked if Eliza had built it so she could have 2 birthdays a year, one in each cabin. Eliza laughed for the first time in weeks. "Not quite," she said, "but that's smart." Nora stayed. Eliza asked her why once, while they were hauling stones down to the creek for a new foundation. "You could go back to town," she said. "They'd find you a place, a husband, a school." Nora didn't stop working. "I already have a place," she answered, "and the only school I need is what I saw here." Eliza nodded, then handed her the heavier stone. The outbuildings began going up in early August. A proper woodshed, a new barn wall, a storage root cellar reinforced with stone Nora helped haul by hand. Amos dug a trench for runoff. Ruth stitched curtains for the shell cabin's few windows, which had never been there before. Eliza didn't tell them to do any of it. They just did. The double cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a home, not a single home, but everyone's. Autumn came early, a chill in the evenings, the scent of bark curling on fresh-cut logs. Eliza caught herself stacking the firewood tighter than she used to, her mind calculating weeks, then months. She didn't need to. The stack was bigger now than it had ever been, but her hands still worked the pattern she knew. Nora watched her one afternoon and said, "You're scared it'll come again?" Eliza paused, then said, "It will come again. Do you think we'll make it?" Eliza didn't speak. She just glanced at the walls, the inner one, where her children had slept, the outer one, where a boy had died 10 feet from safety, the third shelter they'd built in panic, the graves in the back. Then she looked up, past the roofline, toward the black pines on the ridge, and finally answered, "Yes, because now we know how." The storm returned in November, not as sharp, not as sudden, but just as cold. And this time, the shell was ready. They had firewood to spare, food in cellars, thick insulation in the walls, a new venting system Ruth had devised that cleared smoke more efficiently. The fever tent had been converted into a bunkhouse. The shell cabin had hooks now, and benches, and shelves. It was still brutal, but no one died. One morning, deep into the second winter, a knock came at the outer door, not loud, just firm. Eliza opened it herself. A young woman stood there, bundled in fur, snow crusted in her braids. "I was told there's a place here," she said, "for those who want to learn." Eliza stepped aside. "Then come in." By the following spring, word of the double cabin had spread to 3 counties. They sent letters asking for blueprints. They offered land. One even asked Eliza to come speak to a gathering of builders in the state capital. She wrote back, "I don't leave in winter." They wrote again in summer. She didn't answer. Years passed. Children grew. Some left, some stayed. But every time winter approached, families returned to build second shells around their cabins. Some called them skirts. Some called them wraps. The term double cabin became shorthand for survival. But those who had lived through the first freeze knew the truth. It wasn't about the wood. It wasn't about the walls. It was about the choice to build more than needed before you knew how much would be taken. Eliza grew older. Her children married. Ruth's baby grew into a sharp-eyed girl with her mother's voice. Amos died quietly one winter morning while sharpening an axe. Nora eventually built her own cabin across the ridge, smaller but with 2 walls just the same. She named it Echo. Eliza didn't ask why. She already knew. The double cabin still stands. The outer logs are worn now, silver gray with age. The inner door creaks when the wind comes from the west. The graves in the back are overgrown with wildflowers. No one has the heart to pull them. They say the cabin holds heat better than any other in the valley. They say no one inside has ever frozen since. And every child raised nearby learns the story of the widow who was mocked until the winter laughed back at everyone else. And she stood inside her second wall, hands blackened from chopping, face lined from sleepless nights, and listened to the wind howl without touching her children's skin. They called it foolish. They called it wasteful. They said no woman needed that much wood. They said she'd lose everything. But what she built was the only thing the cold couldn't take.